Okay, well, welcome everybody. Fran Unsworth, Director of BBC News and Current Affairs, is in her office at UBH. Fran, thank you very much for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
I will kick off the questions. I've inevitably got a lot of ground to try and cover. And as questions come up, I'll either take them as we go along or do them at the end. So perhaps just let's start by trying to take stock of the scale of this story and the multiple challenges it's thrown up. I mean, people are saying it's the biggest story they've ever covered or likely to cover. You're the head of what is undoubtedly one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, news organization. How do you think you and your teams have been coping with it all?
Well, I have to say, I think it probably is the biggest story we've ever done. And I think it's bigger than 9/11, Princess Diana, all sorts of things. And I guess it was certainly the biggest logistical challenge that we've ever faced. And I think it's fair to say that I was kind of well out of my comfort zone on dealing with quite a lot of the issues that were thrown at us. And it was the need to turn ourselves into a virtual news organization within a very, very short space of time, while you're dealing with the fears of your own staff and the need to cover the story at a time when it's so incredibly important for your audiences. So there were sort of conflicting pressures of, oh, what can we do to keep the staff safe? Which means that, actually we need to kind of get as many of them as possible working from home. That's not possible for everybody though. At the same time as, having to deal with this enormous news story where the public was so dependent on information. And marrying those two things together was an incredible challenge. What we did was, well, we had to equip everybody with laptops, decide who was going to work from home, who had to come into the office, how we were going to get as few of them as possible in the office. And that meant streamlining quite a lot of our output. We, as people will have noticed, have junked quite a lot of programs at first. So we're gradually bringing some of them back. We streamlined our news channels and world news as one stream. We cut the number of studios we were operating out of. If people will have seen, for instance, that the Mars show comes from the news set, Newsnight comes from the news set, so we're only running one gallery. And doing this across the whole of the BBC's news estate is quite a significant challenge because, of course, we're doing it internationally as well. There are a lot of language services. We've got BBC Arabic, which is a continuous news channel, BBC Persian, which broadcasts for 12 hours a day, television bulletins in about 14 different languages. So managing all that and the radio side, of course, was extremely difficult. And then putting in place inside the building the measures that we need as far as social distancing is concerned.
Can you think of any particular pinch points where you actually felt that the operational problems were preventing you telling the story? I mean, I suppose one that comes to mind, obviously, is just getting into an ICU and showing what it was like. And we saw how Fergus Walsh and his crew were able to do that. But there must have been moments of, if you like, where you felt you were meeting almost insurmountable problems to tell the story, or is that going too far?
So the problem getting into the ICUs was that they didn't really want us there because, of course, they had severe logistical problems as well that they were dealing with in how they were treating patients in a pandemic. And so it wasn't the logistical problem of us so much as can we get in? Will anybody let us in? And of course, actually, if you take, I think our first piece was Fergus Walsh, who went to University College London and did some amazing pieces. That must have been probably in April. And that was at a point when actually hospitals were easing up and they felt that they wanted to tell their story too. And it was clearly a really important part of the story, how hospitals were coping at that particular point of the story. And there's so many things you have to think about there, the safety of your people, the perception issues, because you know, Fergus had to go in full PPE. And it's like this was a shortage when time when PPE was in great shortage, and a lot of the viewers were sort of saying, "Well, you've taken up some PPE there," which actually we donated it. But the issues are still about perception and how actually it's really important, nonetheless, to show audiences what is actually happening.
Okay, let's go on to how the story has kind of developed. I said to some colleagues on the Channel 4 board at the start of this that it seemed to me it was going to be about the balance between the one public service duty of putting out health information and the government messaging around that, and on the other hand, holding the government and the health authorities to some kind of account about how that was happening. And it's been interesting to kind of work out who's where on that scale. I mean, the distinctive part of BBC's output, I suppose, is in some ways quite a simple one, which is the transmission of the daily briefings, which you've scheduled on BBC One. They've had good audiences. Obviously, interest is declining a bit now. But let's be honest, it doesn't seem to some people to have been the media's finest hour. I mean, what is your reaction to that?
Well, I'll just put the question back, in what respect?
Well, if you take the Reuters Institute report, which is out, they've been tracking this a number of times, they show that trust in media, or what they call news organizations, so much broader than broadcasters, the trust in news organizations is declining almost as fast as trust in the government. There were the things, those hashtags like scum media. I mean, I took it that in my balance between public health and accountability, that the briefings were a symbol of that. You had the information bit, then you had these nasty journalists asking all these awkward questions, and the public wasn't used to that. Is that fair?
So it's a really interesting point that you're making, because of course, when this first happened, there was a sense in the UK of we're all in it together. This is a terrible crisis for everybody. Everybody's got to pull together. Everybody's got to follow the advice. You saw it in the way the politics was played between the government and the opposition, which was that the kind of opposition pulled their punches. But and just to sort of contest the trust score, actually, the BBC's trust scores actually have increased as a result of this. Sometimes when you ask a question about trust, if you say, do you trust the scientific advisors, then the audience are obviously going to say yes, more than they trust the media on scientific advice. But it doesn't mean to say they don't trust the information that we are giving them. But just to take your point about the irritation that the audience felt, for instance, about the questions that were being asked at some of those briefings, I do think that apart from the fact that actually we know that quite a lot of the science is contested anyway, that although the government say we're just following the science, we know now that actually the scientists don't always agree with each other anyway. But also the political response also became contested, as we've seen over the course of the last 10 weeks or so. And it is the job of journalists to actually ask questions and highlight that, even if, to be honest, the public don't like it. So I do defend the journalists at those daily presses, even though they weren't necessarily very popular with the audience at that point. I do think they were just doing their job in asking questions. It might have come at a point where people felt it wasn't appropriate, but that's still their job.
Is there in any way, though, a correlation between this tracking of the government losing credibility, should we say, and the challenge in the questions? It is, in fact, the challenge in the questions, which in a search, there was at one point it was kind of, why isn't there enough PPE? They're quite general questions. Now we've got these whole series of questions about who said what at what point, and clearly the Prime Minister is uncomfortable with going there. Is that the way the story seemed to you to be going?
I think the way the story well, you sort of respond to each things as they're happening. So, if it became apparent and things emerge, and you have to follow the story and go with it. And of course, it emerged that there was a shortage of PPE, that health workers felt that they were putting themselves on the front line. So that actually gives rise to an awful lot of questions of government which have to be asked. Did you prepare properly? And then there's the care homes issue, which emerged. In fact, Newsnight started doing this with Lewis Goodall back in early April, that actually there was an issue about care homes, which seemed to have very high rates of infection. That raised another set of questions. So I think all the way along, you have to kind of, you know, put your journalists on and they are unearthing things. And then those are the questions that you have to put back to politicians. And they sort of inevitably are not particularly going to be happy about that.
But let's pick up from that, because from the government's point of view, putting a minister up every day at an event which is seen on BBC One, in which journalists appear to be free to ask questions, so they don't always get a follow-up. At the same time, there seems to be almost a boycott by government ministers of Newsnight, of Channel 4 News, of Piers Morgan. So in a sense, the government's able to say, well, what do you mean we take all these questions every day, but avoiding programmes where actually there might be a number of follow-up questions that they may not be comfortable answering?
Yes. I think that's fair enough.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop it just because they won't come on all those programmes, though. And of course, they have been coming on the Today programme and the World at One and PM. So there are you know, some areas where they are subjecting themselves to scrutiny. But just because they don't doesn't mean to say that we don't actually have the opportunity to scrutinise. And I would say that actually they're missing an opportunity a bit, because they can come on and explain, which, you know, which I thought would be in their interest to do so.
And certainly what was clearly a boycott of the Today programme, which had been going on for some time, stopped pretty quickly the moment they thought they needed to get messaging across on the Today programme.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I said at the time when they decided they weren't going to do the Today programme that this was missing the opportunity to speak to 8 million listeners a week. And I do think that, you know, when you get a national crisis, those kind of stances which have to be re-examined if you have an important public health message to get out, which obviously the government did have. And I think that's probably why the you know, Today programme boycott came to an end as a result of that. You know, you've alluded to it. I wish they would put themselves up more widely on Newsnight in particular for scrutiny of what's going on and explanation of what's going on. You know, this is not. I think the public, and this is probably goes to your earlier question, why the people might have felt irritated with journalists, because I think the public, possibly, and this is sort of anecdotal, can see that this is a really, really difficult thing to manage for a government. And yes, maybe mistakes were made. Maybe there was a problem with the planning. Maybe the responses haven't been quite right, but this is unprecedented. And I think the public are probably quite prepared to cut the government some kind of slack on this, on not getting everything right. And I sort of think it would help quite often to make those kind of things more transparent and explain the trade-offs and the difficulties. I sort of think they're missing an opportunity, really.
Okay, let's move on to the issue of impartiality. Let's remind ourselves what the BBC editorial guidelines say, because I think it's really important. They say that your journalists and your news and current affairs presenters, in other words, off-screen and on-screen, may provide professional judgments rooted in evidence, but may not express personal views on such matters, effectively news matters, publicly. And that includes BBC branded output, personal blogs, and social media. We'll come back to social media later because it's really a separate issue. So Newsnight on 26th of May began, Dominic Cummings broke the rules. The country can see that, and it is shocked that the government cannot. Now, the very next day you announced, we believe the introduction we broadcast did not meet our standards of due impartiality. Now, you could have let the complaints procedure run its course, and some of your predecessors probably would have done that. But you stepped in and made a judgment straight away. Why did you do that?
Because I was acting on what I believed was the case, that it went further than the editorial guidelines allowed us to do. So, you know, I felt, why would I wait for somebody else to make a judgment which I had already made for myself? So, you know, I didn't need to wait for some complaints process to take its course here, if actually I felt that the introduction had gone slightly beyond what I felt was appropriate in terms of what our editorial guidelines are.
So did you need to consult with the Director General or anyone else?
I did consult with other people. Yeah, I don't rely just simply on, you know, I always test my judgments as far as possible against what others are thinking. And I had a discussion about it amongst my colleagues, yes.
Okay, looking at the reaction to your decision, particularly, and indeed to what was said in the introduction, it's interesting that it falls into two camps in terms of media commentary. So you have Will Hutton in The Observer. The subhead to his article said the BBC was cowed into disciplining her, meaning Emily Maitlis, by a bullying government which doesn't want us to know the truth. So what would your response to that be? Well,
the first thing is that we didn't discipline anybody. And I think it's really, you know, important to say that. These judgments are fine. It's a fine line between what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And sometimes, you know, we go over it. But there isn't, I don't think, any question of us being cowed by the government over this. And I thought it was interesting that Will Hutton was actually more complaining about the process than I felt about the actual judgment. But we have editorial guidelines. You've just read them out. And I felt that they had been crossed in terms of attributing motivation to the public, to the Prime Minister, and that's the basis on which I made my judgment, not on the basis of anything that the government had said to me.
So yeah. Do I understand from that what you're saying is that the problem arose from the lack of attribution rather than necessarily the statements themselves? Had there been, to take your from the guidelines rooted in evidence, if Emily Maitlis or whoever approved her script had said, you know, there is evidence that the public think this and this, that would have been okay with it?
I think it would have been, yes. And in fact, the programme was followed by a very good piece by Lewis Goodall and a piece by Nick Watt, where all their points were evidenced. And I think that the programme felt, well, what Emily said was evidenced in the programme that followed. I don't think that was quite the case. I think that actually, if you're going to talk about the Prime Minister having blind loyalty, then, sorry, I think that's me. I've got rid of it. If you're going to talk about the, you know, blind loyalty, then to Dominic Cummings on the part of the Prime Minister, then I don't think you can necessarily attribute motivation in that way. And I think there were just other lines in it too. That, you know, the country was shocked that you know, that Dominic Cummings had broke the rules and the government couldn't see it. Well, actually, maybe not all of them were. You know, we've got no way of knowing that.
Can I pick up the other side of the response, which is actually critical of you as well? It's one of those classic things when you can't win. These are commentators who basically thought something should have been done about this long time ago. So you have Libby Purvis calling it a change of direction from a BBC chronically terrified of upsetting on-screen talent. You have Matthew Syed writing of the serial editorialising of Emily Maitlis. You have your former colleague Roger Mosey writing, much of the blame sits with the BBC management, who have been woolly and contradictory in their determination of what impartiality is in a modern broadcasting environment. You want to respond to that tone of attack?
Well, I think it just shows how difficult my job is, actually, to be honest. I cannot please all of the people all of the time. We can't. You know, it's sort of, you know, the BBC will be perceived in one direction by one group of people, in another direction by another group of people. And whilst I don't subscribe to the, if everybody sees you as biased, then you're okay, I don't buy that at all. But we do live in a very, very polarised society. And actually, I do think that it's really quite difficult for the BBC to sort of stay out of that polarisation at times. And we often are perceived in certain ways by one side in one particular aspect and the other by another. We've just got to carry on doing what we do. That's all we can do.
Now, it's not often that either the BBC management or regulators say what you said. In fact, you know, when I was at Ofcom, I don't think we ever had a judgment affecting the BBC, or even if I'm honest, ITV, about a breach of impartiality. So this is a rare moment. And when there have been those rare moments, normally the reaction inside BBC News is to say, how dare they? So what's been the reaction inside BBC News to what you've done on this occasion?
Well, actually, it might be rare that breaches of impartiality get as far as Ofcom, but actually our own editorial complaints unit deal with breaches of impartiality all the time. So this was a pretty prominent one, but it's by no means the only one. So I think that BBC News staff...
What are you saying? They're getting used to them?
Well, I'm not quite saying that, but what I'm saying is that we're doing so many hours of broadcasting and publishing stuff online every day. We receive enormous numbers of complaints, comments, you know, thousands of them about what we're up to. People feel very strongly about what we do and complain a lot all the time. And we always assess those complaints, and if we think that they're correct, we will act on them. So it's not true to say that actually this isn't an issue that we deal with on a daily basis.
But I suppose what I'm getting to, has there been a hostile reaction inside BBC News and Current Affairs to what you did?
Well, you know, I think Newsnight felt, you know, yeah, we had a robust discussion. Yeah, let's put it like that. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say though that, you know, I think that Newsnight has had an absolutely brilliant journalistic run, in fact, over this pandemic, and have really, really been on the stories. You know, they got to the care homes first. Katie Russell did something last week on a particular chain of care homes. Gabriel Gatehouse was onto the differences between the Swedish approach very early and the approach that the UK are taking as far as lockdown are concerned. He did some great stuff from an Italian hospital. So it's, you know, that is the totality of what Newsnight is all about.
Okay, one final point to this before we move on. With hindsight, if I were the counsel for Emily Maitlis and the editor, Esme Wren, I would point to some research from the Reuters Institute tracking public opinion over this period that shows that actually, at about the time we're talking about, actually this is what the public felt. And of course, also with hindsight, we have the Durham police finding that there had been a minor, but still a breach of the regulations. So to get to the bottom line again, there's a good case for saying that actually what Emily Maitlis said in that first sentence at least had some root, it was rooted in evidence, but your problem was it wasn't attributed anywhere and there wasn't a question mark about it. Would that be a fair summary?
I think it was rooted in evidence, but it was the language in which it was put. And also you said the Reuters, I think the Reuters research showed, for instance, that something like 70% of the public felt that Dominic Cummings had done something wrong. Durham Police, and that was a few days later anyway, the Durham Police, you can only judge what has happened at the time, not what comes later. But, you know, there's therefore another 30% who didn't think he'd done anything wrong. We're about serving everyone, and just because the majority of opinion is on one side, which I absolutely accept they were, and that's, I think, was, as I say, evidenced by the programme, it was the language in which the intro was phrased, yes, which I felt basically belonged more on the op-ed page of a newspaper than it did as the intro to an impartial broadcast programme.
Okay, let's move on to this area of social media, because it is slightly different. Richard Sambrook, one of your predecessors, is going to do a review for you of this issue, of the use of social media by, well, BBC journalists in particular, and I guess some other BBC staff as well. And let's be honest, it's an issue which a number of broadcasters are trying to get to grips with. But here's a new one on me. I was listening to More or Less yesterday, Radio 4 current affairs programme. It's been highly praised, rightly, for the way throughout this whole saga, it has tried to look at statistics in a cool and detached way. And yesterday, the editor of the programme, Richard Varden, did something which I don't think I've ever heard before. He appeared on the programme himself as an interviewee. In other words, the presenter said, well, with me now is the editor of this programme, Richard Varden, making a rare appearance. And it was become clear that Richard Varden had appeared on this programme partly to point out that he had tweeted something months ago and he had been proved right. And I kind of thought, well, is this what it's come to now? The editors of the programme will pop out to say, look how clever I am. I said something on my tweet months ago and everyone now agrees with me.
I didn't hear it, to be honest, so I don't know the context. I couldn't comment on the context in which he was doing that. I mean, the only thing I would say is that actually editors of More or Less have probably appeared on the programme before because they do quite a lot of the research on it. So I think that
they're not normally interviewed by the presenter, are they?
I think they can be, actually. Yeah, sometimes they have been. Yeah, because they have, as I say, have done the research on it. But you know, I mean, obviously you didn't really like it very much, but I didn't hear it, so I can't really say.
I'm
go back and listen to it then.
No, I'm all in favour of editors being held accountable. I always think, you know, they should, you know, happy as a former editor have been held accountable. But to get on and plug your own Twitter feed seems another thing. Anyway, look, let's move on. Let's get back to this issue of trust, because obviously there's some useful Ofcom research on this and other research, as you said. And in terms of what do people who use the media make of it? And undoubtedly, the BBC is clearly the most used source of news information, which is actually clearly one of the reasons that makes your job so important. What struck me was that if you come to trust and you ask a question as Ofcom did, who do you trust highly, and then go through them one by one, actually, there's virtually no difference between BBC TV, ITV, Channel 4 and Sky News. It may be because the question has previously been asked, who do you trust most? And the BBC normally comes top, though I can remember a period when the ITN brand name was used rather than ITV, that ITN would often be only a point or two behind. But what we now see in this research is actually there is virtually no difference between the public's view of the different public service broadcasters, and I include Sky News in that. So what have you made of your competitors' performance during this story?
Well, I think I fly the flag for public service journalism full stop, to be honest. And I think I've seen some very good journalism on both, ITN and Channel 4 News and Sky. And, I think that, Beth Rigby's asked some extremely, pertinent questions. So I think that actually the issue is that people clearly trust news which actually purports to be impartial. And that is the role that public service journalism seeks to play in this space. And I think it's clearly valued by audiences who actually probably value it more than they do the press. I mean, to be honest, all my figures actually, the BBC does come out more trusted, to be honest, partly because I think our audiences have been enormous in this period. So, you know, in that week of lockdown of March the 23rd, I think it was something like 44 million people in the UK tuned into the BBC News that week. Our audiences have been huge. So I think, you know, that is a demonstration to me of the fact that people are obviously want to seek their information from the BBC, otherwise we wouldn't have those figures. But, you know, I'm not, as I say, I think all of the kind of the remit of the public service broadcasting, which is around, you know, breadth of opinion, impartiality, as it is in the UK, has a vital role to play. And I think that this pandemic has demonstrated that.
Okay. Can I go back to social media for a second? Because there's a question come up which puts the point I made probably more directly. Are you happy that your news presenters and journalists comment freely on social media, or should this change in the interest of impartiality?
So, and it's a really, really difficult one, this, which is obviously why we've asked Richard Sambrook to come in and take a look at it. You know, because social media is obviously, well, not obviously, but is a force for good. It's a way of getting information out to particular sections of the audience who now make it their main source of information. But it has its limitations, and it lacks context quite often. You know, what you can get into a limited number of characters doesn't always fulfill the requirements of BBC editorial values. It makes it quite difficult. But on the other hand, you know, we have seen sort of how you can reach so many more audience. So I'll give you an example. We did this, the BBC Africa service did this great story about a killing in, I think it was Congo, which where they used graphics to put together and find out who exactly had murdered these women in a village. And we just put it out as a social media thread, and it reached millions across the world. And if you didn't have social media, you wouldn't have that access. But having said all that, it also can become a bit over opinionated in terms of fitting in with BBC editorial values.
Because in a sense, this is becoming, as more and more platforms exist, this is becoming more than just tweets, really. So here's an example. John Simpson has on YouTube a video. It's basically him talking about stories in the news for about 4 or 5 minutes to camera. So it's got no BBC branding on it, but it's the BBC's World Affairs editor. And I looked at one the other day in which he talked about something that Donald Trump has said as being shameful. Now, would John Simpson say that on the air? Probably not. So why can he say it on what he calls Simpson's World? Is there a Simpson's World and a BBC World?
Well, that's a good question, that, isn't it? Which is something that I think that Richard has got to look at, because of course John doesn't work for, you know, entirely for the BBC. He does other things in his life, and it's the same with quite a lot of other members of staff who are freelance with us. So what license do they have to actually express their views elsewhere is something that we've got to look at.
Okay, let's move on to the area of misinformation, and BBC has really taken on this challenge, isn't it? Really, of trying to help people through to cope with the world of misinformation. Again, I point to the Ofcom research, which showed that basically 50% of respondents had come across the theories linking the origins or causes of COVID-19 to 5G technology. Now this, from my viewing, was one story where you actually did a story about people hearing about this theory. Of course, often it's said, well, don't do that because that way more people get to hear about the theory. but what prompted you on this occasion to say, no, we need to do this story?
So we talked a lot about that, and we said, you know, by doing this, are we giving this story more salience than it would have otherwise? And I think, and actually, Newsbeat were very instrumental in this, because it kept coming up amongst their audience time and time again, that there was this thing going round that 5G was a factor in coronavirus. So it's at that point that we sort of say, do you know what, we think we should nail this, and we think that we should do something about it, and absolutely say it isn't true. But you're right, you know, you can't just go round chasing down every bit of misinformation that appears on the internet and sort of knock it down. That's not what our job is. It's when it gets some traction, and it looks like, I think, you know, whether it might become dangerous not to address it as a story.
Okay, let's look at the implications for a number of things, of threads, if you like, which arise from what we've been through the last 3 months. Let's talk about wider relations between the BBC and the government. Now, back in January, if we can remember that far ago, the conventional wisdom was that Boris Johnson's government was gunning for the BBC. And there were a number of things said by the government from which the only assumption you could make was that they were gunning for the BBC. Then, as the BBC was perceived to be doing a good job as a public service broadcaster on COVID-19, the perception, the conventional wisdom became that the government dare not touch the BBC. Somewhere in between, we had the government pretty much complaining about the panorama the BBC made about their handling of the virus. I mean, where do you think we are now? Are you in the government's good books or bad books?
I can't spend too much time considering it, to be honest, because our first responsibility is to the audiences. So, you know, my job as the director of news is to make sure that we're providing the audiences to news outlets with what they need. And of course, there is always going to be a bit of a conflict there sometimes between that and the BBC's corporate interests. And I can't possibly ever get involved in that, because we would be, you know, dead with audiences if we were. So all I can say is that, you know, if I had to kind of, you know, make a judgment about it, which you're asking me, I would say that the more valuable we are to audiences, then the greater our standing probably is going to be with the government, truthfully.
Understood. But of course, when we had the appointment of Tim Davie, we had Tim Davie getting the word impartiality. I think it was about the sort of fourth sentence of his kind of, you know, how pleased I am to be DG. Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, got impartiality into it about the, you know, how pleased I am to hear from Tim Davie about impartiality. So you've got this dialogue going on between you, or whether it's not, it is a dialogue at that point. Are you completely isolated from that then?
Well, I'm not completely isolated from the debate about impartiality, no. Obviously, that's absolutely central to what the BBC does. And of course, you know, that's not just you know, Oliver Dowden obviously made that point, I guess, because he wants to make sure that whoever the next Director General is upholds those values. But, you know, they're in our charter. So it's the, you know, #1 public purpose. So I don't think there's any issue about that. But of course, you know, during the election campaign, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. This isn't a kind of government thing. This is it's a left-right thing as well, actually. We are seen as, I know, there's a kind of environment in which we all exist now, which is a bit sort of, if you don't just reflect my perspective, then you must be on the other side. And actually our job is to say, no, our job is to reflect everybody's perspective. That is the mark of a civilized society, that we all have differences and we all have to live with them. And the BBC will enable that and help people live with them and provide a platform for everybody's views. So.
Okay, let's move on to implications which are very much even closer to home, which is about the BBC News budget. And I can see that we're getting a couple of questions on that. So let me start by reminding people that your target, if I remember rightly, was, well, not your statement back in January was that 450 jobs would have to be cut in order to achieve a target of £80 million by 2022. Can you kind of update us on whether that is still the plan?
Yes, it is still the plan. When we, so we had a plan about how we were going to deliver that, but it involved actually trialing a new operating model. And when the pandemic hit in March and we had to send 90% of the staff out of the office to work from home, and also we were so focused on delivering to the new reality that we paused. But we still have the savings target, and actually the BBC's financial position has got worse since then, because we have picked up we have delayed the cost of free television licenses for the over 75s. In addition, of course, the BBC got a dividend from BBC Studios, the commercial side, which came back into the license fee. BBC, that dividend is not going to happen this year because of the collapse in production and ad revenues for everybody. So we still have to meet our savings target, and there's another wider BBC one as well. So we are working through at the moment how we get that process restarted, because we are going to have to get it restarted, and we're busy thinking that one through.
Have you decided when you can restart it?
No, not yet. No, we're figuring that one out. A lot of it sort of depends on how the story goes. We've got quite a bit of change coming. We've got a new DG. But over the course of the next few months, we'll have to.
Do you think the new DG might be persuaded to think that, given what BBC News and Current Affairs has achieved for the position of the BBC in these interesting times, that you might be relieved or get some remission from your target?
Well, I doubt it, to be honest, but because the whole of the BBC is under pressure. But I think it's important also to say that this savings target was also about modernising what we do. It's not just a savings target. It's also about saying, is the way that we deliver news actually fit for the modern world in which we find ourselves, where actually there is an enormous shift into digital platforms, out of linear services. Do we produce some absolutely great journalism around the BBC, but does it travel as far as it could do? Does it get picked up by every outlet and used in a way which actually maximizes the value of that? And so our kind of operating model was designed to tackle those things too, which is why, even if somebody said to me, oh, you don't have to make all those savings, I would still want to go ahead with a lot of the changes that we were thinking of doing, because I think it's right for the new world.
But of course, as you are asking those questions of yourselves, you are seeing this whole new way of doing different things, which you have experimented with and in many ways succeeded with in the last few months. So I can see Kate Bulkley asking, given new processes to create the news, are there cost savings to be had going forward, and by how much? I can see Lee Tomlinson that says, what things, if any, that the BBC News operation changed during the COVID crisis do you think you might keep after lockdown? What's your response on those?
So it's very interesting. So I was saying, that 90% of our staff are now working from home. And you know, the people that have to come in are a lot of, you know, studio managers, for instance, who are running the radio programs, Unsung Heroes. Get people running galleries who have to come in. Some of the presenters obviously have to come in, and production teams do it on daily output. Not all of them. Some production teams, kind of, some of them are working from home, and some of them are working in the office, or some of them work from home for some of the day, and then might come in to put the program out, say. So it's a question of, and I think that if you...
Well, the question is, are they going to come back to the office?
Well, I think the point is that when you ask our staff, you know, how's it been for you? It's a very mixed experience, to be honest, because you find that a lot of people would say, do you know what, I really think that this working from home thing's worked out absolutely fine, and I don't really feel the need to slog in from zone 6 into central London 5 days a week. Thank you very much. I can do my job quite easily from home. There are others who, you know, might be living in shared houses, don't have that much space to work from home. It's been very difficult for people with school-aged children trying to do a full-time job, for instance, trying to kind of deal with, you know, homeschooling or whatever, and working at the same time. So we've got to kind of find a balance between this, because clearly we have demonstrated that people don't need to come into the office all the time. So I don't think we need to go back to exactly how we were working before. I think that we can actually think about that going forward and try to kind of find some balance for people. We've also said that, you know, the question was about have we sort of saved money. We obviously saved a lot of money on international travel, but, you know, we've also spent in other areas, to be honest.
But there's another way of looking at this. You explained very sort of clearly and helpfully earlier how you'd had to kind of remodel the schedule, you know, the sharing of certain, I mean, the news channel and the World News Channel, there must have been changes, I think, in overnight radio. BBC News Watch has disappeared. In regional current affairs, which I know isn't technically part of your empire, but the issue of Inside Out, a programme which is frankly the only English regional current affairs programme on television, there's a question mark over that. You know, as you look at the savings you need to make, you must have thought, well, look, I changed this and no one seems to have minded, and so actually some people think it's better. Why don't I make some of these changes or these cuts permanent?
Well, I think one would have to, we've been in crisis mode, so we will not always be in crisis mode, but it does give us an opportunity to look at things and make an assessment, but I don't think we'll necessarily carry on exactly as we are at the moment, and we probably won't go back to completely how we were prior to this, and we'll have to kind of figure that out over the course of the next few months.
Okay, just a couple more points because we're getting questions around this. Some people have felt that certainly maybe for the first month or two of this story, they'd actually reminded people that television was quite a big thing. Have you any thoughts now about whether the move to digital might be going too fast in compared to you know, the traditional outlets, shall we say, being cut to fund more digital outlets?
So, as I said earlier, you know, we've seen these enormous figures to television news bulletins, particularly the 6 o'clock and the 6:30. And I think that does demonstrate that when there is a crisis, that is a moment for people to unify around to find out what's happening, what to make of it. And of course, that's what television news gives you in a way that the digital space doesn't always. It doesn't tell you necessarily what you're supposed to, you know, what you might think about something. But having said that, they're also a captive audience, and we don't know whether, we have seen an increase in the 16 to 35 audience as well, to those kind of traditional outlets, which we thought And we thought that they were a sort of lost audience to linear television bulletins, and they haven't been. But I do think there is a question mark over the longevity of that, to be honest. You know, everybody's at home, the parents might be in charge of the remote control. It's difficult to make a judgment at this stage that what we saw over the past 5 years about a decline in linear audiences for television and an increase in the digital ones is not something which actually will continue when all this is over. So it doesn't make you reverse your strategy, it makes you take stock and consider.
Okay, thank you. I hope people weren't distracted by the appearance of my cat in the background. We'll press on. So, you and I discussed that I thought we should find time for discussing the implications of the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matters into this discussion, because it is obviously so much across everything that the BBC does, the importance of that. Let me put to you something that the New York Times media columnist Ben Smith wrote, that journalism's biggest newsrooms, and I presume by that he means inside the United States, are trying to find common ground between a tradition that aims to persuade the widest possible audience that its reporting is neutral, and journalists who believe that fairness on issues from race to Donald Trump requires clear moral calls. Has there been such a debate in the BBC newsroom?
Yes, I think there has, yes. And there have been suggestions, yes, that the BBC should, take on board some of that. I mean, I think this is a really kind of complex area, and I sort of was saying yesterday on one of our staff calls that, the BBC is not neutral about this story. It's not neutral about the fact that it's not impartial about racism. It's not impartial about the fact that it was very bad, that what happened in Minneapolis and racism in general. But nonetheless, and we've seen this over the course of the last week, there are areas where it goes into public debate, matters of public policy, which we do have to treat impartially. What shall we do with statues? What shall we do with the education system? Is it too focused on, Britain's empire history and not enough on actually the effects of Britain's empire history? So there are all sorts of subject areas which require us still to exercise impartiality in how we report those debates.
Right, is it impartial on whether there is an unacceptable level of racism in the UK? Is there agreement inside the BBC that there is an unacceptable level of racism in the UK, particularly in UK institutions, or is that not accepted as agreed ground, should we say?
No, I think that is an agreed ground, because we don't apply impartiality on the one hand on the other. That's not what impartiality is. It's due impartiality. So whilst there might be some people who say that that Britain isn't and its institutions aren't racist, actually the weight of opinion on that is that actually there is a lot of racism in Britain, and the BBC does accept that. It's where you start to debate the consequences of it, the issues that surround it, what you do about it. That requires impartiality in how you treat it. Because
I can hear callers to, for instance, on Nigel Farage's programme on LBC, who say that the mainstream media have adopted Black Lives Matters as a piece of basically PC, the latest version of PC, and that it, for instance, means that they overlook when a demonstration turns violent because they don't want to appear to think that they are reporting a mostly peaceful demonstration as a violent one. Do you recognise that as a legitimate school of argument?
So the BBC actually didn't endorse Black Lives Matter because it's a campaign. It can endorse the sentiments behind it, but it didn't endorse it as a campaign. And actually our reporting of the protests at the weekend made it quite clear that actually it had ended the day in London with some violence. And that's about kind of what weight do you give that? And these are editorial judgments on the day. Because I think that if a lot of people will say, well, actually, most people march perfectly peacefully, and it was a peaceful march all day, which ended in some ugly scenes in the evening. And it's about how much you focus on all aspects of this, which gives some kind of truth about what happened to the audiences.
But I mean, I think Matt Hancock said, actually, at a coronavirus briefing, we believe, or I believe, Black Lives Matter. So can you, as the director of BBC News and Current Affairs, say, I believe Black Lives Matters, or is that an endorsement of a campaign?
Well, you can say, I believe Black Lives Matter. It's a statement of obviously fact, isn't it? But when you say, does the BBC sign up to hashtag Black Lives Matter, that is a recognised campaign.
Okay, I'm trying to pick up now a couple of other issues. One reflects really to the way we're doing this as a Zoom call. It's become totally mainstream now to see something like these on television. Max Eagle says, would this shift in attitude to remote interviewing rather than flying international contributors over to new broadcasting house continue after COVID? I suppose there's a sort of underlying dig. Is international reporting going to be cut so that you can do it all over these kind of links?
Well, to some extent, I think it's probably the answer to that. But you know, we have if we cut out all international reporting, then we would not have actually, you know, we've had Mark Lowen, Sima Katecha in Italy, Gabriel Gatehouse doing some absolutely superb on the ground reporting of what was going on in Italian hospitals, and the same in Paris, the same in Madrid. You know, you do need people to be in these places to be giving us a view of what is happening in the world. So, you know, we will be wanting to continue to do that when this is all over. Can we do more people over Zoom? Yes, I think that what this pandemic has shown is that the audience are more tolerant of things which aren't as high quality in broadcast quality as we possibly thought they were. And that, I think, is kind of a lesson that we can apply going forward.
Yeah. A couple more points before we run out of time. A lot of people, this is from Anna, a lot of people from different industries are now on furlough. Did the same thing happen with the BBC staff? Did they end up furloughing some people too? Or is the demand for media higher than ever now? Can you just clarify what the BBC News policy was on furloughing?
So it's a BBC-wide policy on furlough. So I think that our commercial entity has furloughed some staff. The public service side hasn't furloughed staff because I think it was indicated that the government wouldn't, you know, pay out in the terms of public service staff. I think that we have, you know, paid anybody's who was booked for a shift until the end of May, and I think that there was sort of, we are considering what we're doing going forward at this particular time. Okay.
Fran, I think this is a good moment perhaps just to wind it up before we run out of time. Can I say thank you so much for finding an hour to do this. You've answered a whole range of questions. Thanks to Danielle and the staff at the RTS for making it all happen. Thanks to the producers, Martin Stott and Sue Robertson. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. So cheers, everybody. Okay, bye.